My goodness, we're almost on time. But of course, this is a very casual meeting, so we don't be too concerned about time. Nonetheless, I think all of us would like to finish up so that we do have an opportunity to go out once again this afternoon for a little more kite aerial photography around the Monterey Bay area. In any case, Susie, my wife, and I have been doing this sort of thing for about 6 years now. And we found out that early on as a hobby, people got interested in this and that we could start to work it into our teaching in the Earth Science program at our university in Kansas. And then we found out we could actually get funding to do this sort of thing from NASA and other sources. And the tie-in is that we use kite aerial photography to get lots of detailed imagery on the ground so that we know that we're looking at specific kinds of soils and vegetation and landforms and human land use and so on. We can then take this information as a basis for interpreting satellite imagery. And of course, that's the tie-in with funding sources from NASA. NASA is promoting the observation of the Earth from space using a variety of satellite sensors. But of course, we have to know what we're looking at on the ground before we can interpret those images properly. So I think without further discussion, we'll go ahead with the slide presentation here. And I guess we'll need to turn off this projector. Thank you. And maybe we want to crack open the doors on the side to get a little airflow through the room while we're doing this. Yeah, and shift it just a little bit, Susie. That's good. Well, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the basics here. People say, what kind of kite do you use? We use all kinds of kite. Basically, whatever works in a given situation. So we use the Sutton airflows quite a bit. Next. We use Delta kites. We find them to be quite stable flyers. Next. We really like Rokaku kites because, again, they're stable, high-lifting kites. Next, please. And then we have a lot of equipment. This box shows the rigs that we use most often. We have 3 different systems that we take into the field quite a bit. I'm going to use the fireplace poker, but I'm not going to bang on the screen too much. Anyhow, this is the box we took to Estonia 1 year ago. And that was our second trip to Estonia. We've been there 2 times, both times with kite aerial photography in mind and a lot of cooperation with the local people. So we have our radio transmitter here. We have a single camera rig here with the Olympus stylus. We have a Canon digital ELPH there. And turned upside down is a Canon Rebel SLR camera. And that one is hanging over next to the stone pillar right now. All of these rigs built by our mentor, Brooks Leffler. No, I'm okay. I like to have the feel of something that could defend me in case the students jump up.
It was Jim in the Nautilus room with the poker.
Yeah. Well, normally I use something like a yardstick or a meter stick, and then if somebody falls asleep, I can just sort of slap it down accidentally. Anyhow, this box went to Estonia, and we were there during the 9/11 incident, so things were a bit anxious for a while, but everything came back just fine. Next, please. All right, so I'm going to focus mainly on some of the photographic techniques we use. And I'm going to start off with this picture that shows our university campus. And it's just a typical color image. You can see part of the football field back here with green grass, composite red material on the track around it, some green trees and grass, dormitory buildings, cars of various colors. Next, please. And now here's the color infrared version of that same scene. This is something called false color imagery because these are obviously not the real colors that we would see. In color infrared, the active vegetation shows up as bright pink and red. And by active, I mean these are green plants photosynthetically active during the growing season. So we see the green trees here. We see that this is a real football field with real grass, not artificial turf. There's some more grass back there. Notice what happened to the red track. It's now kind of a washed out cyan blue color. There are no more red cars here. Most of them appear yellow and white. So all the colors are shifted. Now, in terms of what you're actually looking at here, let's start with the yellow filter on the camera. The yellow filter has eliminated blue light. So there's nothing blue in this picture. What we actually see are green, red, and near infrared. Green, red, and near infrared. And these have been shifted to the blue, green, and red colors of the picture. So that's why it's called false color. Now, the near infrared here is not heat. This is not the thermal part of the infrared spectrum. Thermal or heat energy cannot be sensed by normal photographic processes. So this is the infrared just beyond the visible part of the spectrum. And it turns out that this wavelength of infrared is very sensitive for vegetation. It's also very sensitive for water bodies. In fact, this film was originally developed for camouflage detection, because if we put artificial turf on the field there and painted it green, that's not natural vegetation. It doesn't show up as red on the color infrared picture. Now I'm going to pass around a roll of this film. It's 35 millimeter film. It fits in any 35 millimeter camera, but I wouldn't suggest you try this in any point and shoot camera. First of all, the film has no speed rating. So that means there's no barcode on the metal canister. Most cameras do not meter near infrared energy. So the camera's light meter is more or less useless for this film. And if you just pop this film into most cameras, the camera will default to some preset ASA or ISO standard, which is probably not appropriate, and the results will most likely be disastrous. And you don't want to experiment too much with this, because the roll of film costs about $25. Beyond that, developing this film is just like any other color slide film. It's exactly the same process, and for us it costs exactly the same amount of money, which is about $6 to $8 per roll. The difference is that this film has to be developed with no infrared lighting in the developing machinery or darkroom. And so that's where the special processing comes in. And I always have to write on my film instructions, great big letters, color infrared, and then I write the processing number down. And most of the time the film lab gets it right, but not always.
What process number is it?
AR5. Process AR5, and it's just like E6, except no infrared lighting in the processing darkroom. Yes, Scott.
Talk about the camera settings that you're using?
Well, we'll come to that.
Okay.
We'll come to that. Camera settings have been established strictly by trial and error. I started off with some camera settings developed by one of our German colleagues, Irina Marzolf, and those turned out to be completely wrong because she used a different camera and a different lens. So it turns out that every camera and lens assembly has its own characteristics in terms of how it transmits infrared light through the lens to the film. We've eventually decided on a shutter speed of 250, and the only variable then is the f-stop. And our f-stop range is usually between f8 and f11. But this is a judgment call in the field. We look at how high the sun is in the sky, how much active vegetation is on the ground, because you see it's the active vegetation that creates most of the brightness in this picture. We consider the time of year, the latitude that we're at, the amount of cloud cover, but it's all a guess when we come right down to the final settings. So we have to adjust the camera manually on the ground, set the f-stop and shutter speed, and then up it goes, and we hope for the best. And after 2 or 3 years of doing this, that's how we've narrowed down the light settings that work for this camera and this lens. But I don't guarantee that they'll work for another camera and another lens. Question?
How do you have to handle the film when you load it into the camera?
Good question. The film canister says, handle in complete darkness. That never happens in the field, of course. And it's never been a problem for us to load it as long as we're in a shaded or relatively dark area, but we don't use total darkness for loading and unloading the film. The other thing about our camera over here is that the camera manual says never use with infrared film. And the reason for that is because the camera has a frame counter, and it counts sprocket holes. There's a little tiny infrared light in the camera that counts those sprocket holes as they go past. Well, that only exposes the sprocket holes. It doesn't reach the image part of the film. So the image area of the film is rarely, if ever, affected by that condition. All right, let's go on. Well, we'll see more. I've got more coming up here in various places, and you can ask more questions as we go.
I was wondering if you have trouble transporting and storing the film if you have to keep it a lot cooler than normal film.
We treat it just like color slide film, normal color slide film, and we always have a little cooler to make sure that the film doesn't get overheated in the car or something like that.
Thank you.
Is it more sensitive to X-rays?
No, it's not sensitive to anything beyond the spectral range of normal film and the near infrared. All right, we've gotten into studies of lots of areas where vegetation is a key factor, including some wetlands. This is a wetland site in Kansas called Cheyenne Bottoms. Very important bird migration stopover site. It's a Ramsar wetland site. And this is a view in late winter in normal color, low water, vegetation is not active, cattail marsh is dormant here. Next picture. Now here's a view in the spring. There's been some rain, it's filled up with water, the cattails are now green. And so we're doing a lot of work where we repeat visits, seasonal visits, year-to-year visits, in order to document changes. And this particular site is managed by the Nature Conservancy, and the director there said that these pictures were the best thing he had ever seen to evaluate his management success. Next, please. Here's an example of an artificial situation. Once again, this is a wetland, and in this case, the sort of scars that you see here were excavated by bulldozers to create depressions or potholes, and then a natural succession of vegetation has started to come into the area. And our goal here was to create an accurate map of the site. And it's a small site, so this is the perfect technique. You see we've laid out some targets on the ground. These targets measure 5 feet square, 1.5 meters square. And then on the ground we use GPS equipment to carefully document the location of each target. That means we use 2 GPS units and we set them up on a site for about 10 minutes each to make sure we get stable readings. Next, please. Here's a vertical view. Some of my students working there at one of the target sites. And we did a lot of vertical photography to create stereo imagery and overlapping imagery. And on this basis, then, we were able to create a map of the site. Now, one of the puzzling things here is that some of the potholes are successful. In other words, they hold water. Other potholes tend to dry up. So we were trying to figure out why. Next, please. And here's the color infrared version of that. The potholes that have water appear in this really bright cyan, blue, green color. You can see there some. And then the potholes that dry out still have moist soil but no standing water, and so they appear very dark. And it turns out this was related to the soil conditions at the site. Soils that were more sandy tended to dry out faster. Soils with less sand held water better. And so it was pretty easy to document this with the aerial photography we did. Next, please. All right. Now, I know a lot of people are opposed to fire in the natural world, but in the prairie region where we come from, fire is what keeps the prairie in its natural state. Without fire, shrubs and trees would soon grow up and the tall grass prairie would disappear rather quickly. So our university has a natural area, and every year they burn part of it. And this is something that's been going on long before European civilization. We know that the Native Americans burned the prairie, and of course there are natural lightning-caused fires even before that. So we decided a couple of years ago, wouldn't it be neat to get some kite aerial photography of the prairie burn? So here we are, and you can see that this is done in a controlled manner. Notice how the smoke is drifting here. The fire was set at the downwind side of the prairie, so now the fire burns slowly upwind. This way it's under control. To do it the other way, the fire quickly races out of control. All right, next please. All right, so now the fire has advanced. You see it moves like a wall of flame through here. It moves rather slowly. In fact, you can pick a low spot and just walk right across it if you're a little bit brave. And there are always a lot of photographers on the ground doing this because this creates really sensational ground pictures too. I won't go into all of that, but anyhow, you see there's a big billowing cloud of smoke coming up here. Next, please. And the smoke is coming closer. I should say that this is always done in the springtime, so early April, before anything is greened up. And next picture, please. And now we realize that it's very difficult to control a large kite in a billowing cloud of smoke. There are a lot of thermal currents swirling around up there. And then we thought there are a lot of hot embers and ashes and things up there, and our kite is made out of nylon. So we quickly maneuvered ourselves out of the way. In the meantime, the people on the ground had decided to protect us, so they lit a little backfire all around us in a circle. And we were also enveloped in the smoke of that. So we decided to move out on our own. One of our more dramatic episodes. Next, please. Now, we have a long-term study project at a military base called Fort Leavenworth in northeastern Kansas. Most of you, at least most Americans, will understand that Leavenworth is not a place that you would like to spend a lot of time because it has a state prison, a federal prison, and a military prison. It's actually a very safe place to live, of course. Anyhow, this is the Missouri River in the background, and we're interested in the forest cover here. There are two kinds of forest. The forest in the foreground is up on the bedrock upland areas, and then there's a forest down in the river valley on the bottomland back there. Next, please. So here's a view in late spring, early summer of the upland forest. This is an oak forest, a mature hardwood forest. Next, please. And we've been studying this forest for quite a long time using climate records and tree ring analysis and ground observations, trying to figure out how this forest responds to changes in climate. And the main tool here is satellite imagery. Well, it turns out that this forest is a very rough canopy, and this is particularly evident in this color infrared picture. You see there are lots and lots of shadows in the forest. They look like holes almost. Well, that's obvious in the kite aerial photographs, but it's not obvious on satellite imagery. So knowing that this forest has a rough canopy with lots of shadows helped us to better interpret the satellite imagery for this area. Yes, Ken. Well, some forests have a very level top to them. All the trees are the same height. They have the same, you might say, spacing. And so the top of the forest canopy looks smooth.
So is that due to variation in types of trees or different ages?
Different ages, different types. This is a rough canopy because the trees have a lot of different heights. There's some trees that stand up high above the surrounding trees. So some kinds of oaks grow taller than other oaks, for example. And that creates more shadows in the forest, which affects the appearance of the satellite image of this particular forest. Next, please.
Do you do spatial spectral analysis on images like that?
On the satellite images, yeah, definitely.
You could do it on yours too.
In principle, yes, we could separate the different color bands and come up with something called a vegetation index, and so on.
Spatial spectral analysis, which would give you an idea of the, I guess, the power spectrum
Of the dimensions, yeah, that could be done also. Here's a view over the lowland or bottomland forest, and you see the Missouri River back there and part of the forest here. This is a different kind of forest with mostly willow and cottonwood trees. In the foreground is an area that was burned just one day before we visited. This is the bottomland prairie and part of an airfield in the background. You always have to ask permission before you fly a kite on a military airfield. In any case, this was burned on purpose to clear the prairie. Next picture, please. And it was a pretty intense fire because this prairie had not been burned for 20 years, so it had a lot of dry, dead stuff ready for combustion. And it turned out the fire jumped over the dike and went way into the forest. Way out even into here, you see that the floor of the forest burned, which is not necessarily bad. It's the sort of thing that happens naturally from time to time. And in fact, this fire was so hot or intense that it killed the trees right along the edge of the forest here. And we were able to document by coming back a month later, taking more photography and seeing which trees had leafed out and which trees had not. Next, please. All right, now I know that some of you are avid golfers when you're not flying the kite. So let's talk about golf courses. Golf courses are highly artificial environments in most situations, outside of Scotland and Ireland perhaps. They need a lot of irrigation, they need a lot of herbicides, a lot of pesticides to keep that nice green grass nice and green. Well, here's a color infrared photograph of a golf course from western Kansas. And we did the photography here to help the people who are concerned about managing the turf, the grass of this golf course. This is an area that's dry, so it needs lots of irrigation, and the golf course was running out of water. So that's the bottom line. They needed to figure out how to use less water to manage their turf. And you can see that these bright pink areas are, of course, the fairways and tee-offs and holes. The water bodies appear very dark in the background. Next, please. All right, so here are a couple of the links. Here's the tee area on one, and there we are. And here's the hole of the next one. Everything that's pink here means it's getting irrigation. All right, so notice the pink circle here. This is one watering circle, and it looks like quite a bit of the rough is getting some irrigation here. Well, that's a waste of water. Here's another circle, and right here the circles overlap. And in the overlap area, the grass on the golf course is dead. It's getting too much water. So there are a lot of small things that could be done here to better manage the application of water on the golf course. Next, please. Here's one site that had been set up by the consultant we were working with, and he had laid out a grid. You might be able to see the tiny dots on the ground here. He had laid out this grid to test different kinds of herbicides and fertilizers and so on to see if some combination could help improve the vigor of the grass. I'm not sure we got any good results out of this site, but at least we provided the imagery for him to look at to further analyze. Next, please. I should say golf courses are also great places to fly kites because they're usually open. There's a lot of people walking around trying to stay out of your way mostly, and hopefully the ball doesn't come up and hit your kite. Or camera, right. All right, so let me talk a little bit about Estonia now. We went to Estonia 2 years ago on a faculty exchange, and at that time we were interested in looking at landforms, particularly glacial landforms created by ice sheets that overran the country during the Ice Age. And this is one of my specialties. Here you see a long, narrow peninsula that sticks out into the Baltic Sea from one of the Estonian islands. And this is a kind of landform called an esker. Craig may have some familiarity with these things, which are very common in Wisconsin. An esker is a ridge of sand and gravel. It was deposited by a river that flowed under the ice sheet. And when the ice melted away, then essentially the bed of the river is left as this mound of sand and gravel. Next, please. Here we see a very smooth landscape. This is a long, long hill in through this part. And on one side is a lake, and on the other side is another lake. This long, streamlined hill is called a drumlin. And once again, Craig undoubtedly has seen hundreds of these in Wisconsin. Drumlins are elongate, streamlined landforms molded under the ice sheet as it moved over the landscape. So these kinds of pictures are really great for my teaching purposes to show students what these landforms actually look like from above. Next, please. We're getting a little reflection, I think, from some of these lights. Let's see if we can reduce that a little bit. North wall lights. There. Okay. There we go. Okay, last year we went back again to do bogs. These are, well, some of you have read about the Sherlock Holmes stories where people get lost in the Dartmoor and sink into the bog and so on. Well, that's exactly what this landscape is like, and the Canadians may recognize that a lot of their country looks like this. In any case, bogs are places that are pretty difficult to work in because it's hard to move around on the ground. And these are also natural areas, so they don't want helicopters and airplanes flying in low and disturbing the wildlife. So it turns out that kite aerial photography is a great way to get up above the bog and take some pictures that cannot be acquired by any other means. This is one of the bogs we worked in, which is in effect a national park. So they have a boardwalk here and an observation tower. This is about 10 meters or 30 feet tall. Looks sort of small in this picture, though. And what we did here was to lay out survey markers at 20-meter intervals on the boardwalk and then start taking pictures. So this is an oblique view. Next. Here's a vertical view. And these pictures turned out to be fabulous for the people we were working with. These are scientists who have spent their entire careers working on these bogs, and they said, "We have never seen such images. We had no idea that the bog looked like this." And they've spent their whole careers in these places. You can't see this stuff on the ground. And it's not obvious on conventional air photos either. Lots of colors here. Water, the green is submerged moss. The sort of golden yellow is moss just above water level. Then there's sort of a reddish brown zone. This is a different species of moss growing higher. And small pine trees here. These are dwarf pine trees, maybe 8 to 10 feet tall at most. Next, please. And then we did some color infrared here. And this really surprised us. It surprised everybody because you see the bright pink and red is restricted to a very narrow zone around the margins of the pools in the bog. The active photosynthesis is highly localized in these bogs. And that has some implications for how the peat accumulates and how methane is produced and other things of interest to people involved in environmental science. Next, please. Okay, another bog example. This is a different bog. And a lot of you have probably seen this in some of your pictures. A bright spot called a hot spot. This is an example of what's called the opposition effect. This is the point on the ground that's in direct alignment between your camera and the sun. And at that point on the ground, there are no shadows, no visible shadows. And so it appears overexposed, a hot spot. And this will happen anytime you aim your camera away from the sun and at the same angle down from the sun, especially in areas of prairie, agriculture, uniform surfaces like this bog surface. The very first roll of KAP I took had a hot spot in it, and I couldn't figure out what that was. I thought, oh, they've ruined the film. Somebody messed up the developing, but later I discovered what it was, and now it's quite common. Generally to be avoided if you're trying to look at the landscape because you can't really see what's here. Anyhow, this bog has a lot of water in it, and notice how the bog circles around an area with trees. That is a bog island. It's an area where the soil, you might say the mineral or solid soil, rises up higher than the bog surface, and that soil, in this case, supports a forest vegetation cover. Next, please. All right, so a quick vertical view. showing the water-filled pools, the different color zones representing different kinds of moss growing at different levels relative to the water. Next, please. Here's an oblique view. In the foreground is this island, this mineral island. And it turns out that the vegetation around here has a very distinct pattern. In the foreground is a pine zone, pine trees. You can also see the pine on the other side here. Next, there is a zone of birch trees. And we were there at the time when birch had dropped the leaves, so just bare white trunks are visible. And behind that is the actual deciduous forest composed of maple and elm and oak, and some of these were starting to show their fall colors. So a very nice view. Next, please. Here's a similar view in color infrared. It turns out that pine is fairly dark when viewed in color infrared. Then we have the birch zone and then the deciduous tree zone. The ones that have started to turn color are sort of an ashy gray in this picture because they're no longer photosynthetic. They don't have green leaves anymore. The ones that still have green leaves show up as the bright red colors.
Does that have something to do with the water content?
Possibly. It has to do specifically with the cell structure of the leaves. And leaves that are photosynthetically active absorb red light. That's what drives their photosynthesis. And they reflect near infrared to prevent overheating. Now, when the leaf dies, the chlorophyll is gone and the leaf structure starts to dry up. And so it doesn't have that special characteristic anymore. Next, please. Oh, yes. Okay. An all too familiar story. There aren't many trees around, but you know there's an attraction there. And if you take your eye off the kite for even a second, there it goes. Next, please. Fortunately, this was a good stout hardwood tree, so I was able to climb up. And what most people make a mistake at here is to start to pull on the line. That's the quickest way to destroy your kite. So let the line go loose. Climb up in the tree if you can, unhook the line, unhook the tail, and chances are you can get the kite out. Next, please. And that's what I did here. And in fact, we recovered everything with no damage, believe it or not. Okay, next, please. I think that's the last one. I have just a few more comments. Oops. There we go. So we found that this kind of activity is quite interesting. Those of you who liked those Estonian pictures may like to have a copy of an article that was recently published called Patterns in Estonian Bogs as Depicted in Color Kite Aerial Photographs. This is pretty unusual for a scientific publication because we got it in color. So we've got lots of color pictures in here, some of the ones I showed today plus others, and some discussion of infrared photography, including how it affects shadow effects and other conditions. So just check with me later if you want to pick up a copy of this. Questions or comments? Craig?
The way you were able to duplicate the views from using the different film, were you lifting two cameras at one time, one with the infrared and one with the standard film, or did you just go back and just do your best to relocate the camera?
Yeah, we've actually done both. We have one camera rig that carries two cameras mounted back to back to take simultaneous pictures of the same scene. That's a pretty heavy rig, which is not the main problem. The main problem is that the shutters are slightly different in how they respond to our radio control. So sometimes one camera will take a picture and the other will not. Or sometimes one camera will take 2 or 3 pictures and the other only takes 1. So it's pretty touchy to use that rig. Mostly we just use a single rig, the one over there. We put it up in the sky, we shoot a roll of film in all directions, then we bring it down, put it up again, shoot another roll of film in all directions, hoping to get closely similar scenes. Scott?
Comment, there's a device that works with a lot of digital cameras called a DigiSnap that
Yeah, now digital's another issue. Kodak used to make a camera specifically for this purpose, a color infrared digital camera. It was frightfully expensive, about $10,000.
What about the filters?
And, well, I'll get to that. Anyway, this Kodak camera was widely used for 5 or 10 years in the remote sensing community. However, Kodak has discontinued it because it had so many problems, technical problems, and I guess people complained too much. Anyhow, in principle, any digital camera can sense near infrared. Most digital cameras have a filter built in to eliminate that. Some do not. The problem is that the near infrared sensitivity is about 10% of the normal visible light sensitivity. So it's almost impossible to do this kind of photography using a digital camera. I'm waiting. I'm waiting. Another 5 years, maybe we'll have one at a reasonable cost. And that would be nice.
You explain hot sauce.
Hot spots. Okay, here's the sun. Here's your camera. There's a spot on the ground. Direct alignment. The hot spot is down there. The camera is so high up it doesn't cast a shadow. It's way too small and it's too far away to cast its own shadow.
I think you can see it from airplanes sometimes, can't you?
Yeah,
See, they got a bright spot around the shadow.
right.
Is that, I'm just too hot and if I look back, it's like right on the ground, right half.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's a hot spot.
Yeah, oh, okay.
Exactly. It's a very common phenomenon, although most people don't recognize it. Elvie?
What are you using when you're trying to georeference your images on your on land? Because I have a hard
Yeah, what?
a flag or something down there and trying to see it up in the air.
Yeah, we use a big, what's called an aerial target. It's basically a piece of plastic that's 5 feet square, and it's got a bold black and white pattern on it. And these show up really well from above.
How do you carry those? Are they fold?
They fold up. Yeah, we just have a toolbox that's got a bunch of those folded up, and then we use tent stakes to hold them down. Or you can put rocks on the corner, whatever is handy to keep those in place for long enough to do the photography.
You shifted color by using a yellow filter. Was there another filter, or was it just the yellow filter?
Just the yellow filter.
That's all, that shifts everything.
Right. Well, it's not just the filter, it's how the film is constructed. So it just happens. I didn't do anything except follow the instructions.
Do you use any black and white infrared?
I haven't done that. I haven't done that myself. In principle, you could do it with this same film and just put a visible blocking filter on it.
Because I know there's a lot of medical infrared film that's pretty easy to get out of.
Yeah, certainly.
Is there any useful public domain image analysis software that you employ or recommend?
Public domain. Yeah.
No cost.
Free.
It depends on what level of complexity or capability you're interested in. Probably the best system is something called GRASS that was developed by the U.S. Army and is now in the public domain. I haven't used it personally, but I know some people who swear by it.
Like grass or grass?
Grass, just like the vegetation. Yeah, grass runs on Unix type machines, as I understand it. I'm not sure it will run on the ordinary PC. There may be a PC version.
Probably distributed in source code.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe we should move on. We have several more speakers this morning, and Paul, I believe you're up next. So Paul's going to tell us about some of his work. Thank you.